My maiden name, is Anita Marie Sackett, a name I hated at school, but since I've been a writer, I like to use it and be proud of it. I'm also known as Mrs. Anita Howard. I was born in Rushden, Northants, just after the war, and when the war ended, my dad was sent to Malta, and we met him about a year later, and we had 2 years living on the edge of an aerodrome, and I had an idyllic childhood. We then came back to Rushden in Northamptonshire, which is a boot and shoe town, or was, and we lived with my grandmother in a Victorian house with no electricity and no bathroom, etc., as many people did. I went to junior school and the county high school, and I played hockey, loved sports, was captain of the junior hockey team. I went to junior school in Rushden, Northamptonshire, and then on to the county high school, and I loved hockey and played for the county and captained it. And then I went to Avery Hill Training College in London to be a teacher, met my first husband at a jazz dance, Cy Laurie, and we wanted to travel. I worked in Balham, then I went to, I think it was Wandsworth, 2,000 girls it was, comprehensive school, huge. And then I got married, had my daughter, did a session, I think it was about 1 term in Hackney, and then we applied to go to Australia, but eventually we got a job in New Zealand. So we sailed out on the Ruahine, went round the world to New Zealand via Panama, stopping at Panama City and Tahiti, just after the Beatles had visited. We didn't see them, but there we are. Arrived at Wellington, and on the quay I thought, I don't know anybody here. It was very lonely. We arrived at Wellington in pouring rain, which of course it is, windy Wellington, and we spent 3 years in a place called Stokes Valley, a little boomerang-style house, and I taught out there because I said to my mum, we're going for 3 years, I'm going to save up to come home, we just really want to travel. And that's what we did. Long story, but there we are, came back via Suez. So we called in at all the Australian ports, Singapore, went to Cairo, saw the lovely antiquities there, and nearly got to Malta, but it was too rough to get into the harbour, and eventually arrived back via Naples to Britain. And we came to Chelmsford. My first husband worked for Marconi's. I did a little bit of supply work, and my son was born. And then he got the job in Jamaica with Cable and Wireless. And we went for 6 months, and it turned out to be 5 years. So we had 3 years and then a break, came home on leave, and then another 2. And I taught while I was there in it was a prep school, Roman Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic, but when you work in countries like that, especially Jamaica, the jobs go first to the Jamaicans, but they were short of teachers and nurses, so that's how I managed to get the job. And I played hockey out there. Not a lot of hockey teams, but I would say the Jamaican team was of a county standard. And I found myself playing against England and Germany and Holland because they were going to New Zealand for the World Cup. And so that we were a stopover. And we took them the night before we played England, took them to Devon House and gave them some Devon duppies, which were rum punches. Strong ones, great ones, but they still beat us 5-0, 5-love. Anyway, it's great experience. We met lots of interesting people. I loved the island. Yes, it has its problems. There are social problems, but you know, there are problems in England too. And it's a beautiful, beautiful country, and I made many friends, school friends, and I love the rum punches and the Jamaica Christmas cake. That's another story, because I do talks all about that as well. So, where do we go now? Well, came home to Chelmsford, and unfortunately had a breakdown. I think the thing was I worked hard, played hard, was spiritually, emotionally low, was going through a tough patch. Don went out to Zambia and I coped, and then it all fell apart and I was hospitalised 3 times. Somehow I managed to get back on track. He went out to the States, to Maryland, and I followed about, about a few months afterwards with the children, and had about 1.5 to 2 years there. Met some lovely people. I met a lovely lady who saw a cross I was wearing, and she said, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think I am." And she happened to do sacred dance, and that was a lovely way of being able to relax, very cathartic. Met some, again, lovely people. Maryland's a lovely place, not like you think of Chicago or anything like that, but very idyllic. And then after that we parted. I came home to Chelmsford, and that was a very bad time. I didn't have a breakdown again, but obviously depression isn't helpful. And then eventually I met Michael. We've been married 34 years now, and I met him at Gingerbread. First of all, I went to solo clubs, but I didn't like it. It wasn't my scene at all. But Michael has never let me down. He's great, and he helped me get back on my feet, and he also allowed me to be me. But one of the things I forgot to mention was when we were in the States, I started to write. It just all came flooding. First of all, it was spiritual, but I don't tend to share that unless people really would need to read it or wanted to read it. But one of the poems that I wrote was called The Lonely Dragon. This is a poem called The Lonely Dragon, and it was one that I wrote in America, and probably the first children's poem that I have written. Now we're going to pretend this is a dragon because my other dragon's broken, which is a shame, but there we are. That's how it goes. So, right. Once there was a dragon whose friends had gone away. He was so very, very sad. He cried and cried all day. But one frosty day in winter, he found a little frog, all muddy, wet and shivering in a great big murky bog. The dragon felt so sorry for this frozen little one, so he breathed his flames of fire and he warmed him like the sun. And the little frog was happy, and he kissed the dragon's nose, and in the swirl of rainbow smoke a dragon friend arose. Now each day they play together, and they search the icy bogs to breathe their flames of fire, to warm up frozen frogs. And when I do that, I say to the children, now, they're warming their hands as if it's by a fire, because you have to watch health and safety today. Now, it's never been published. I think a lot of people think it's a bit sentimental, but I think a lot of children would actually like that. I really do. And so there we go. That lovely little poem, The Lonely Dragon. And so that was really the start of what I started writing. And I do like writing for children. And I have had quite a few poems published. So, where do we go from here? When I came back, I tried to get back into teaching. I wasn't really well enough, but I thought I've got to do something. And Mum always said, well, if you're a teacher, you'll always be able to get a job. But Maggie Thatcher had just got in. There were lots of jobs that were chopped. 30 people would apply for a job for an ordinary teacher. And having worked abroad, that isn't always to your best advantage. So I worked as a hairdresser's receptionist, and I did shampooing. I worked in Marks and Spencer's at Christmas, and then supply teacher for several primary schools. And then I got the chance to work at a private school, St Sed's, for 9 years. So it worked out to 9 years. And I got married to Michael in 83. And when I was at that school, I shared my love of poetry with the children that I taught. And that was level 3. They were about 7 and 8 year olds. And they loved it. And people used to say to me, well, how do you get time to do it? Well, I said, well, I've got a great big stack of books there. I said, they can come up and choose any of my poetry books. And then if there's a minute before break, I'll choose a short one. And then I would read poems to them and I'd go, like that. And then I'd say, well, what was wrong with that? You're going too fast, miss. And then I'd read it in a boring voice. Well, that wasn't, that was boring. We didn't like that. And gradually, when they read their poems, had listened to me and did what I said without me lecturing them. And then gradually, I entered them in for Cadbury's competition and the Smiths competition and local competitions. And they did very well. And they won prizes. And I would share my poetry with them. Now, as a writer, when you first write, you know that what you've written is not the best, so you have to edit and re-edit. I said, don't rub it out, just cross it out. And I'd show them, put them up on the wall, all the crossings out that I'd done until I'd reached the final one. And somehow, over the years that I taught there, when they first came in, and they've had that constantly all the way through to the end of the year, then gradually they got the idea. And I had a poetry club after school, and in that club, you were able to use long poems, like ballads. You didn't have time in school, like the Highwayman. And then you could tell them a little bit about the history and then the poem and discuss it. And I think when I left the school, obviously it didn't continue. And this is what happens, because I run the Essex Young Poet of the Year. And you get schools sending in their stuff of enthusiastic teachers' poetry. When they retire or leave, there's no one to carry on. And that's a shame, because there is talent in that school. And our problem is trying to get to everybody about the poetry competition. And it's difficult. So, I have taught in Holland. I've been over to the British school and the international school, and many counties I've been to, Buckinghamshire, Hampshire. I've even did a little lesson in Zimbabwe. Some friends of ours lived there, and so on. And of course I speak to Rotary clubs, U3As, WIs. I've talked to history groups and drama groups, and I really do enjoy it. And most of my talks, they started off about the 40s and 50s, because in this book, The Street to Mango Moon, the first part of it is all about my life as I grew up in Northamptonshire. I was there from 48 to 59 when I went to college, and I do have a good memory. And the first poem that I wrote was when my mum died, and we lived in a terraced house, no garden at the front. We used to play in the street. That was the house that had no electricity and bathroom to start with. Dad changed all that. And when Mum died, all the memories came floating back, as they do. Some memories, of course, are sad. When I read this, obviously I'm evoking other people's memories. But this was the first one that I got published, and it is called The Street. And I try and use a little bit of vernacular to make it a little, give it more atmosphere. Our street, with dustbin lids and sticks. We play cowboys and Indians against the kids of the next road, or swung with skipping ropes from the tall lamppost bars. You'll hang yourselves, said a neighbour. We use the post for rounders, ball bouncing on the front doors. Ha! You go play at the end of the street, said Omar King. I can see you, I'll tell your mum. People chatted to each other on their way to work, and sirens hooted at dinner time. And at 5:30, apron factory workers treaded home to tea. We were not allowed to street play on Sundays, but you can play in the backyard if you don't make a noise. Coronation year, we had a party. There were competitions held in the factory during the rain. "We won the cup for the best decorated street," we chanted to our rivals. There were flags and bunting and fancy windows. Ours had a golden miniature coach on a blue velvet cloth. The street was friendly then, and we knew everyone in the road. But no longer is it so neighbourly and safe. Cars line the street. People rarely walk along the pavements. The shop has changed hands yet once again, and they only sell 2 kinds of biscuits. Well, they won't last long. The street seems dead. Old Ma King died years ago, and we sold the house later that year. Now, the reason I read that poem is because that was the first one I ever had published and was paid for. It was published in the 1989 edition of Junior Education, which is published for schools, and they were doing a theme on streets, street furniture and the rest of it. And so I sent it off and they accepted it. It was in the magazine, but they didn't put the right sort of lamppost, with the 2 bars that you swung round. They put a modern one in. And The Street was the first poem that I ever had published in Junior Education, which was a magazine for junior teachers. And I got the wonderful sum of £15. So you're not going to get rich unless you're Pam Ayres by being a poet. But that was the start. And then I wrote to a guy who was a poet called Wes McGee. He had written an article in a magazine about schools in America, about breakfast that the children had. I wrote to him and told him about my stay in America, with my son going to school, and it was similar to the article. And I sent him poems, and he said, yeah, I'll put them on file. Well, I knew what that meant. But he invited me to go to the Poetry Society in London at its original place. And when I was there, he introduced me to a compiler, Jennifer Curry. She asked me to send stuff, and I did. And I had The Last Rabbit. It was a poem that was in her book called The Last Rabbit, and that was in it. And then another one she had. So anyway, she used, and there was a book called Dove on the Roof, and I had another one about Malta because it was about war, and I had seen all the aeroplanes crashed in Malta as a child and didn't really know what it was. So 2 more poems published, and then there were more and more, and gradually you got on various poets' lists. But sadly that all seems to have stopped now. I think it was because in the 80s and 90s there were a lot of poetry books around, and then I think money stopped. Don't know quite what happened, and so I haven't had a child's poem for a long time, but I have had a lot of Jamaican poems published. Now, when I returned to Britain, I went to a WEA class, and it was in near Ongar, Epping. And one of the things that we were told to do was write an acrostic. Now, for those who don't know what an acrostic is, the title is at the top. That was Caribbean. And then it goes down, and it gives us sort of like a frame for children to work on, and without starting with I, or whatever. But this acrostic actually does rhyme. There are some near rhymes in it, and that's not so easy to do. And it's also got odd lines, so what do you do at the end? So I sort of rhymed the last 3. And when you live in the Caribbean, all the islands are different. So in Barbados, you'll get flying fish, most of the islands have coral reefs. In Trinidad you have the steel bands. In Jamaica you have reggae. And Anansi is a Spider-Man. And he's half man, half spider. And he's in folk tales. And he comes all the way from Africa, and his stories were brought by the slaves to the Caribbean. So there we are. So I did cheat a bit because I couldn't find anything for I. So instead of putting snow cone, I put ice cone because it's chipped ice. And then they poured the juice on top of it. So it goes: coral reef and carnival, Anansi, trickster, Spider-Man. Reggae rap to sunsplash beat, ice cone syrup, juicy sweet. Breadfruit fried, tasty dish, blue mountain and flying fish. Emerald sea, blazing noon. At Christmas, poinsettia bloom. Night time come, the mango moon. Now that one has been published several times by Macmillan in the Caribbean, and they produced a great big poster which I have over there. This is a mini one. It's been in several books and it's one of my most favourite.
Yes.
When I when I have been into schools, I have taken my posters, lots of pictures of all the wonderful colourful things, lots of artefacts like the we have over in the corner there. Perhaps you'll show them. The coral, the coconuts, the rasta hats with the dreadlocks, beautiful sea fan, the spices. And so I take all those things in and explain them to the children when they come up and they want to touch the things. But you have to be careful, because one school said, oh no, they can't touch the coconut, although it's ages old. But you do have to be very careful about allergies and things like that. I do lots of travel talks with slides because I've travelled a lot. I lived in New Zealand, as you know, and Malta, but only a few old photographs of that. Then I had the time in Jamaica and the time in America. But since I married Michael, he likes travelling too. And we had friends who lived in Zimbabwe from 95, 94 they went out. Things were getting a bit better with Mugabe at the time. And we went 3 times. So we spent almost 3 months there over those 3 times. So I do that. I do talks on Jamaica, of course. We've been to India and Sri Lanka, and most recently China, Cambodia and Vietnam. We've been to Costa Rica when it only cost about £600. It was Jules Verne, and they did it for a week. And now when I look in the magazines, it's quite expensive, yeah. Now, I like to teach children to be observant. And I was actually in Portugal at the time when I noticed this gecko on the wall. And the man, we were in an ornithologist's house, and he said the gecko has tiny little hairs, so it clings to the rough concrete. So I said, what, a bit like Velcro? And he said, yes. So I made this up. It was in Portugal, but we used to have lots of geckos and lizards in Jamaica. So it has also been published several times. The gecko has tiny hairs on its feet, and when it goes on the wall is bumpy and it clings to the wall. So I said, oh, it's like Velcro. Yes, he said. So I'm sitting by the pool and I'm musing and thinking. I don't need a mobile or anything like that. Thinking, Velcro, eyes, flies, and it came. And this is one of the most popular poems I've ever written. People love it if they're old or very young. And so, the goggle-eyed gecko stealthily goes, creeping along on his velcroed toes, flicking his tongue to catch the flies. Gecko, gecko, goggle eyes. And I do this in WIs if I'm doing my Jamaica talk, and I do it with children, and I get them to repeat, and we all do it once again, and they have to come in with the rhymes. And that is one of the modes. Do you want me to do it again? I'll do it again. So, the goggle-eyed gecko stealthily goes, creeping along on his velcroed toes, flicking his tongue to catch the flies. Gecko, gecko, goggle eyes.